I was folding freshly washed clothes when my cell phone buzzed on the kitchen table. The metallic vibration against the wooden surface felt like an omen, a warning that something was about to collapse. I answered without much thought, my hands still smelling faintly of soap. On the other end, my daughter's voice came sharp, almost rehearsed. She said she had sold my beach house. No hesitation, no explanation, just the blunt announcement as if she were reading a grocery list. Then she added she was leaving for a trip the next day and ended with a short, cutting word. Bye. For a moment, I stood frozen, staring at the basket of white laundry as if my whole life had been folded and put away without my consent. But instead of breaking down, I drew a long breath and let a small smile appear. Quietly, almost to myself, I whispered, "You forgot one detail, darling." There was no one left on the line to hear it, yet I knew those words carried a weight that would return to her one day. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 71 years old, and if there is one thing life has taught me, it is that silence can be a mother's sharpest weapon. The beach house, what my daughter believed she had turned into quick money, was never a whim. It was the result of years of saving, of skipped dinners so I could tuck away a few dollars, of weekends where I carried bricks myself to help the workers. Every corner of that house held fragments of my life. Children's laughter echoing barefoot on the porch, arguments that ended in laughter, the salty wind pushing through poorly sealed windows. I still remember the first time I took my daughter there. She was only 8 and wrinkled her nose at the strong scent of sea air clinging to our clothes. I smiled because I, too, had once found it strange, but I knew that smell meant freedom. It was proof that I had carved out a small piece of the world where no one could evict us, or at least that's what I believed. As the years passed, she grew older, and what to me symbolized dignity became, in her eyes, nothing more than a possession. She never cherished the stories embedded in the walls, nor the faded photographs scattered across the shelves. Her gaze was practical, almost merciless. Everything could be reduced to numbers, contracts, money. With the dish towel draped over my shoulder, I thought about the irony of it all. After so many years of being treated like an ATM mom, used for quiet loans and unacknowledged favors, I was now discarded along with the very walls that had sheltered us. Only this time, she didn't know everything. There was a secret my husband and I had kept. A secret powerful enough to turn her betrayal into a lesson she would never forget. In the back of the kitchen, the wall clock ticked each second like a war drum. I knew that phone call wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a larger battle. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel fear. I felt strength. The beach house was never just a property. To outsiders, it might have looked like a modest 2-story home by the shore, a simple wooden structure painted white with blue shutters. But to me, it was the proof of every sacrifice I had made, a living monument built brick by brick out of exhaustion, patience, and hope. When I close my eyes, I still see myself in my 30s, scrubbing hospital floors at night and sewing clothes during the day, every aching muscle whispering the same promise. One day, Margaret, you'll have a place of your own. When the house was finally ready, I cried harder than I had even cried at my own wedding. I remember standing barefoot on that porch, the scent of sawdust still lingering, the salty wind tangling my hair, and thinking, this is ours. No landlord, no threat of eviction. Ours. It wasn't luxury. Far from it. The walls creaked when the weather shifted, and the plumbing never seemed to cooperate. But the laughter that filled those rooms, the summers spent cooking fish on the porch grill, the nights when thunder rattled the windows and we huddled under blankets, that was the wealth I had dreamed of. My daughter, however, never saw it through the same lens. Even as a child, her eyes were restless, scanning the world as if searching for something shinier, bigger, more glamorous. She was clever, yes, and I loved that about her. But there was a sharp edge in her cleverness, a hunger I didn't fully understand back then. I brushed it off as ambition. After all, don't mothers always find excuses for their children's flaws? I remember one summer afternoon when she was 13. She sat on the porch steps, arms crossed, sulking because her friends had gone to an amusement park while we stayed at the beach house. "Why do we have to be here?" she asked, her tone dripping with disdain. "This place is boring. Everyone else is doing something fun." I swallowed my hurt and said, "One day you'll understand. This place is where we're safe." She rolled her eyes and muttered, "Safe is another word for poor." Those words stung, though I pretended not to care. I told myself she was just a teenager, that she would outgrow the sharp tongue and shallow desires. But deep down, a quiet fear took root in me. I knew the world could be cruel, but I had never considered that cruelty might sprout in my own child. Still, I poured everything I had into her. I saved every penny for her school trips, bought her new shoes even if mine were falling apart, and worked overtime to make sure she never felt the weight of my sacrifices. Yet each time I gave, I noticed something shift. Gratitude didn't grow in her. Expectation did. She began to treat my giving as her right, not as love freely offered. Looking back now, I see the pattern clearly. My daughter was learning to use me long before that phone call about the house. Little by little, she tested the limits of what she could take, and I, blinded by love and guilt, allowed it. I let her mold me into the ATM mom, always available, always open, no questions asked. The beach house, though, was different. It was the one boundary I had never let her cross. It was tied to my dignity, my identity. She could chip away at my savings, dismiss my words, even roll her eyes at my cooking, but the house was sacred. Or so I thought. When she told me she sold it, it wasn't just the betrayal of property. It was the final proof that she had never understood what it meant to me, never valued the life I had built with bleeding hands and sleepless nights. And yet, even in that pain, I held on to one truth. She had overlooked something I had been keeping quietly, patiently, for years. That detail would soon turn her triumph into her undoing. My husband Richard was never the most expressive man, but he had a way of protecting me that I only began to understand after he was gone. He passed away almost 12 years ago, leaving me with both an ache that never fully heals and a trail of mysteries I hadn't dared to unravel. Richard had always been the steady one, the one who carried silence like armor. He rarely spoke about money or worries, and whenever I pressed him about our finances, he would smile faintly and say, "Trust me, Maggie. Just trust me." A few weeks before his passing, he called me into our bedroom. He was thinner by then, his voice weaker, but his eyes, those calm, steady eyes, still carried the same quiet authority. From his nightstand, he pulled out a thick envelope sealed with tape. He pressed it into my hands and said, "Open this when the world feels like it's crumbling beneath you. Not before." I remember arguing, insisting I had a right to know what was inside, but he only shook his head, his fingers trembling against mine. "Promise me," he whispered, "you'll wait until the moment comes." Reluctantly, I promised. After his funeral, I tucked that envelope deep into the bottom drawer of my dresser beneath old sweaters and photographs. Life has a way of numbing you, of pulling you into routines just to survive. The years rolled by, and I busied myself with cooking, volunteering at church bazaars, caring for my grandchildren whenever I was allowed. Sometimes I would stumble across the envelope while cleaning, and my chest would tighten. But each time, I remembered his words, not before. Now, standing in the kitchen after my daughter's cruel phone call, I could almost hear Richard's voice again. "When the world feels like it's crumbling." Wasn't that exactly what had happened? The house that symbolized our life together sold behind my back. My own daughter turning her back on me with nothing more than a heartless bye. Yes, the ground had shifted beneath me, and I knew it was time. I went upstairs that evening, the house unusually quiet, and pulled open the dresser drawer. My hands shook as I dug past the folded sweaters until my fingers brushed the familiar edges of the envelope. It felt heavier than I remembered, as if it had absorbed the weight of 12 years of waiting. I sat on the bed, staring at it for what felt like hours, afraid that opening it might change everything, and knowing deep down that it would. When I finally tore the tape, I found more than I could have imagined. Legal documents neatly organized, bank statements, property deeds, all proof that Richard had been building a safety net I never knew existed. While I thought we were just scraping by, he had quietly invested in small businesses, purchased land under other names, and grown a fortune hidden in plain sight. My throat tightened as I realized my husband had kept this from me not out of cruelty, but out of love. He had shielded me from worry, and perhaps more importantly, from our daughter's greed. As I sifted through the papers, a mix of relief and sorrow washed over me. Relief that I wasn't helpless, that my daughter's betrayal hadn't left me destitute. Sorrow that Richard hadn't lived long enough to see the day his plan would protect me. He had known our daughter better than I wanted to admit. He had seen the hunger in her eyes, the way she measured people by what she could take from them. That night, I placed the documents back into the envelope, but this time I kept it on my nightstand. The secret I had carried unknowingly for 12 years was no longer a mystery. It was a weapon, one I would need to wield carefully. For the first time since that phone call, I didn't just feel strong, I felt prepared. The next morning, the phone rang again. I stared at the screen, my daughter's name glowing bright as if the device itself were mocking me. For a second, I thought of letting it ring out, of denying her the chance to speak to me, as though I were nothing more than an obstacle she had already conquered. But something inside me told me to answer, not out of obedience, but to listen carefully, to let her words expose her own heart. Her tone was different this time, coated with a thin layer of fake sweetness that didn't fool me for a second. "Mom?" she began, dragging the word as though it tasted bitter in her mouth. "I wanted to let you know. We've already received the money. Don't worry, I'll make sure you get your share." The way she emphasized those words, your share, wasn't kindness. It was mockery. She wanted me to feel like a child being handed allowance money. I clenched the receiver tighter, but kept my voice calm. "Your share, you say?" I asked softly, forcing the words to carry more curiosity than anger. She chuckled, a light, careless laugh, and replied, "Yes, of course. You don't need much at your age, do you? Edward and I have plans. Real plans. Europe is just the beginning. It's an investment in our future." Her arrogance poured through every syllable. I could almost picture her, standing in her kitchen with her manicured nails tapping against the counter, already imagining herself as someone important, someone admired. She had always believed that status was everything, that money could buy not only comfort, but respect. As she spoke, I thought of the envelope I had opened the night before, of Richard's foresight and patience. She believed she had stripped me bare, but she didn't know the truth, that the house she sold was only a fragment of what he had left me. If anything, her betrayal had unlocked the very moment Richard had prepared me for. I listened quietly as she bragged about her trip, about the fine hotels she had booked, about the business opportunities Edward had promised abroad. The way she said his name carried the same blind devotion she had shown since marrying him, a devotion that made me wonder if she loved him, or simply loved the fantasy he sold her. When she finally paused, perhaps expecting me to cry or beg, I only said, "I wish you both the best." She laughed again, a short, triumphant sound, and ended with the same sharp word as before, "Bye." The line went dead, and the silence in my house felt different this time. Not heavy, not suffocating, but clarifying. She believed she had won. She believed she had finally claimed victory over me. What she didn't realize was that, for the first time in decades, I wasn't afraid to fight back. Richard's secret had armed me with more than money. It had armed me with truth, and with truth came power. I placed the phone on the table and poured myself a cup of tea, the steam rising in small spirals. My hands no longer trembled. I knew what I needed to do next. It was time to stop letting her dictate the terms of our relationship. It was time to set the stage for the lesson she had been avoiding all her life. There are certain memories that don't fade, no matter how many years pile on top of them. For me, they are stitched into my hands, into the ache of my back, into every wrinkle carved by sleepless nights. I can still see the factory floor where I worked double shifts in my 20s, the long corridors of the nursing home where I picked up extra hours, the cramped kitchen where I ironed clothes late at night just to earn a little more. Every dollar I made felt heavy, earned through sweat and quiet endurance, and nearly all of it went to my daughter. I wanted her to have what I never did. I remember the first time she begged for brand-name sneakers, the ones every other girl at school seemed to flaunt. I didn't have the money, not really, but I worked an extra weekend shift and bought them anyway. The way she smiled then lit up my whole world. I thought, this is why I work so hard, to see that light in her eyes. What I didn't realize was that I had started down a dangerous road, teaching her that love could be measured in things. Over the years, the requests grew bolder. A school trip abroad, a car for her 18th birthday, tuition for college she never finished. Each time I told myself it was worth it, that this was what mothers do, sacrifice. I cut corners on my own life, patched old clothes instead of buying new ones, postponed doctor's appointments because the money was needed elsewhere. And every time I gave, I watched her gratitude shrink while her entitlement swelled. The phrase I came to know too well was, "You'll help me, right, Mom?" It wasn't even a question. It was expectation, almost demand. And every time I reached into my purse, every time I signed a check or withdrew from savings, I told myself it was temporary. That one day she would look back and realize how much I had given. That she would thank me, maybe even care for me the way I had cared for her. But the thank you never came. Instead, she began to see me less as a person and more as what I've come to call an ATM mom. Always available, never refusing, never charging interest. My love became currency, my sacrifices invisible. She didn't even notice when I skipped meals to make sure her rent was paid. She never asked why my winter coat was 15 years old while she paraded around in new dresses. One evening, years ago, she stormed into the house demanding money to cover yet another mistake. "You don't understand, Mom," she said, slamming her bag on the table. "I need this. You wouldn't want to see me fail, would you?" I remember looking at her then, truly looking, and seeing not a desperate young woman, but someone who had learned to weaponize my guilt. And still, I gave her what she wanted, because the thought of saying no to my only child felt like betrayal. That was my mistake. Each sacrifice reinforced the idea that I was nothing more than a lifeline she could pull whenever her own choices dragged her down. She didn't respect me for it. She relied on it. As I sat with my tea after her latest phone call, the memories washed over me like a tide, both bitter and clarifying. For years, I had let her use me, strip away my dignity piece by piece, because I thought that was the cost of being a mother. But now, with Richard's secret in my hands and her arrogance ringing in my ears, I knew the truth. Love without limits becomes weakness. And weakness is something I could no longer afford. Richard had always been a man of few words, but his silences spoke volumes. At the time, I mistook them for distance, maybe even indifference. Only now, years later, do I understand that behind those silences he was watching, measuring, planning, and in his own way protecting us. He noticed things about our daughter that I either ignored or explained away. I remember one evening when she was 16. She had just come home from a shopping trip with friends, her arms heavy with bags. I was furious. Where had she gotten the money? Richard asked her calmly, and she shrugged, saying she had borrowed from my purse. My heart ached at the boldness of it. But before I could scold her, Richard pulled me aside. His voice was low, steady. "Don't waste your breath, Maggie. She doesn't see what you do. She sees what she can take." I didn't want to believe him. I told him she was just a teenager, that she would grow out of it. But Richard shook his head. "She's clever, too clever. If you keep giving, she'll never learn to value anything." His eyes softened then, because he knew me. He knew I couldn't stop giving, not when it came to my child. "That's why," he added, "I have to be the one to prepare for the day when giving becomes her weapon against you." Back then his words felt harsh, even cruel. How could a father speak so coldly about his own daughter? But Richard didn't say it with malice. He said it with a weary kind of love, the love of someone who saw the cracks forming and knew how deep they might spread. He began making quiet moves not long after. Meetings I wasn't invited to, trips into town he never explained, phone calls that ended when I entered the room. I assumed he was tying up loose ends about his health, or maybe avoiding conversations that scared me. When I pressed him, he would only smile faintly and say, "One day, you'll understand. Trust me." I remember one rainy night when the roof of the beach house was leaking again. I sat at the kitchen table, crying over bills, terrified we wouldn't make it through the winter. Richard came over, set his hand gently on mine, and said, "Don't worry so much about today. Think about tomorrow." I snapped at him then, told him tomorrow didn't pay the plumber. He only sighed and kissed the top of my head. That was Richard's way, letting me rage while he quietly built something behind the curtain. Now, holding the documents he had left behind, I realized how much faith he had placed in me, even when I didn't realize it. He knew I would need them one day. He knew she would one day cross a line so sharp that I would finally open that envelope. Richard had prepared not just for his death, but for her betrayal. He had known our daughter's hunger better than I did, and in his silence, he had armed me for the storm he was certain would come. As the weight of that truth settled on me, I felt a strange mixture of grief and gratitude. Grief that my husband had carried this burden alone. Gratitude that he had trusted me enough to carry it forward. The storm had come, just as he predicted. And for the first time, I wasn't walking into it blind. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The house was still dark, the air heavy with that quiet hour before dawn when even the walls seemed to be holding their breath. I sat on the edge of my bed, the envelope Richard had left me resting in my lap. Its weight no longer frightened me. It steadied me. For the first time in years, I felt like I had something solid to stand on. But knowledge without action is just another form of paralysis. I knew if I didn't move quickly, my daughter and her husband would push further, maybe even try to tighten legal claims around the house or the money from the sale. I couldn't let them. Richard hadn't gone to all that trouble for me to sit frozen while our daughter gambled everything away. That morning, after making a pot of coffee strong enough to wake my bones, I pulled out my address book. My eyes landed on a name written in Richard's handwriting, David Harper, attorney at law. I remembered vaguely that Richard had met him years ago, some friend of a friend, but we had never discussed why he kept his card tucked safely in the book. Now I understood. By mid-afternoon, I found myself sitting across from Mr. Harper in his modest office downtown. The place smelled faintly of leather and old paper, the kind of room where serious things were discussed and never repeated outside those four walls. He was a man in his late 50s, with sharp eyes that softened when I told him why I was there. I laid the documents carefully on his desk, my hands trembling despite my resolve. He leafed through them silently, his brow furrowing in concentration. When he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes, a mixture of respect and surprise. "Mrs. Collins," he said slowly, "your husband was a very wise man. These documents give you full control over several properties and accounts. More importantly, he structured everything so that you alone decide what happens. Not your daughter, not her husband, you." The words felt like a balm against years of being treated as though I had no voice. For so long, I had been cast in the role of giver, provider, rescuer. Now, Richard had written me into a different role entirely. Guardian. Mr. Harper explained that the so-called sale of the beach house was not binding because my daughter had no legal authority to transfer ownership. The property was protected under Richard's arrangements, and any transaction she made was void from the start. "They thought they pulled the rug out from under you," he said with a thin smile, "but the rug is nailed to the floor." I laughed softly then, the sound surprising even me. For months, maybe years, I had forgotten what it felt like to laugh without bitterness. "So, she sold nothing?" I asked, half incredulous. Mr. Harper shook his head. "She sold air. The house is still yours." Driving home that evening, I felt lighter than I had in years. The betrayal still burned, yes, but beneath it there was something steadier. Power. Not the kind of power my daughter craved. The flashy kind measured in vacations and jewelry. This was quieter, stronger, the power to decide, to protect, to set boundaries I had never dared to set before. As I pulled into my driveway, the sun was setting, casting the sky in shades of orange and violet. I thought of Richard then, of his quiet smile, of the way he always urged me to trust him. And for the first time, I let myself whisper aloud, "I do, Richard. I finally do." 2 days later, just as I was starting to breathe easier, the sound of tires crunching against the gravel outside pulled me to the window. My daughter's car. The sight of it sent a cold ripple through my chest, not because I feared her, but because I already knew she hadn't come to make peace. She had come to claim something she believed belonged to her. She didn't even bother knocking politely. The doorbell rang twice in quick succession, followed by her voice shouting through the door, "Mom, open up! We need the keys and the paperwork for the house." I opened the door slowly, keeping my expression calm. She stood there in a fitted coat, hair perfectly styled, sunglasses perched high on her head despite the cloudy afternoon. Beside her, Edward hovered, tapping his phone impatiently. His jaw was tight, his smile stretched thin like a man playing at confidence but drowning inside. "Keys, Mom," she said, brushing past me without waiting for an invitation. "Edward needs them so we can finalize some details. The buyers want everything settled before we leave." She tossed the words out casually, as though it were already a done deal. I closed the door gently and followed her into the living room, where she had already dropped her handbag on the couch, as though she owned the place. Edward lingered by the doorway, scrolling on his phone, but stealing glances at me, his eyes darting nervously. "You're wasting your time," I said evenly. "There are no buyers. There is no sale." Her head snapped toward me, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." I folded my hands calmly in front of me. "You didn't have the right to sell that house. You never did." She laughed, but it wasn't amusement. It was mockery. "Mom, please, don't make this harder than it needs to be. I know you get confused sometimes with all these documents, but Edward and I handled it. It's done. What you need to do now is cooperate so the money doesn't get tied up." I let her finish, then leaned forward just slightly. "No. What you need to understand is that the house was never yours to sell. Legally, nothing you signed means a thing." For a moment, the room went still. Her smirk faltered, just enough for me to notice. Edward finally looked up from his phone, his forehead creasing. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone sharper than hers. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence hang, thick and deliberate. My daughter hated silence. It left too much room for truth to seep in. Finally, I said, "Your father made sure everything was protected. He anticipated this very moment. The house is still mine, and it will stay mine until I decide otherwise." Her face flushed deep red. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, as though the words were jammed in her throat. Edward, however, didn't hesitate. "You're bluffing," he said, stepping forward. "Show us the papers, then." I smiled faintly. "I don't need to show you anything. The only people who will see those papers are my attorney and a judge, if it comes to that. Not you." The weight of my words settled over the room. My daughter crossed her arms tightly, her nails digging into her sleeves. Edward muttered something under his breath and pulled her toward the door. "Let's go," he snapped. "We'll figure this out another way." As they left, she turned to glare at me, her eyes burning with a mix of rage and disbelief. "This isn't over, Mom," she hissed. I closed the door behind them, my hands steady, my heart strangely calm. For years I had feared confrontations with her, shrinking under her accusations and demands. But not anymore. This time, I had the truth on my side, and the strength Richard had entrusted me with. And I knew that this was only the beginning. The phone rang again that evening, long after the sun had set. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. My daughter's anger has a rhythm, a heat that doesn't cool until it burns through everything in its path. I let it ring twice before answering, bracing myself. Her voice came through the line like shards of glass. "How dare you embarrass me in front of Edward? Do you have any idea what you've done? I stayed quiet, letting her words tumble out, jagged and frantic. You've ruined everything, she shouted. Do you think I don't know what you're doing? You're trying to control me, just like you always have. You don't want me to be happy. You don't want me to succeed. You just want me small, begging you for scraps so you can feel powerful. Her accusations hit like stones, each one twisted into something unrecognizable. I almost laughed at the irony. Me, the woman who had worked herself to the bone to give her everything, now painted as some schemer who enjoyed keeping her down. Mom, I'm not a child anymore, she continued, her voice breaking between fury and desperation. You can't keep treating me like one. I deserve that house. I deserve that money. I've put up with enough of your guilt trips and lectures. This was supposed to be my turn. I closed my eyes, her words echoing in the quiet of my living room. For years, I had swallowed these outbursts, told myself she didn't mean them, that anger made her crueler than she really was. But now, listening to her justify betrayal with such conviction, I finally understood. She believed it. Somewhere along the way, she had rewritten the story in her own mind. I wasn't the mother who sacrificed. I was the obstacle to her happiness. Are you finished? I asked softly when she finally paused. The silence on the line was brief but sharp. Then she scoffed. You're unbelievable. You think you've won, don't you? Well, you haven't. Edward has connections. We'll make this work. You can't stop us. I smiled faintly into the receiver, though she couldn't see it. You've already stopped yourselves, sweetheart. The house isn't yours. It never was. And no matter how loudly you shout, that won't change. There was a sharp intake of breath. And then, click. She hung up. No goodbye this time, not even the bitter bye she had thrown at me before. Just silence. For a moment, I sat there, the phone still warm in my hand. My heart didn't race the way it used to after her tirades. Instead, I felt an odd sense of release, like I had just crossed a line I should have drawn years ago. Still, I knew this wasn't the end. Anger was only the first wave. Behind it, there was always something darker. Desperation, schemes, reckless decisions. And with Edward whispering in her ear, I feared what choices she might make next. As I set the phone down, I thought of Richard again, of how clearly he had seen this storm coming. He hadn't left me defenseless. He had given me the tools to protect myself, but he had also given me something I hadn't recognized until now. Permission. Permission to stop being the endless giver, to draw the line, to let our daughter face the weight of her own choices. The storm was gathering. I could hear it in her voice, feel it in the silence she left behind. And this time, I wasn't the one who would break. Edward always struck me as a man who dressed better than his circumstances allowed. He wore tailored jackets, flashy watches, and shoes that clicked too loudly on wooden floors, as if sound alone could announce success. My daughter had fallen for his charm years ago, convinced his confidence was the same thing as stability. I knew better, but I also knew that arguing would only push her further into his arms. It didn't take long for cracks to appear. A week after our last confrontation, whispers began to circulate. A neighbor of mine, who also happened to work at the local bank, mentioned that Edward had been in and out of their office multiple times, looking strained. Loans, she said in a hushed voice, glancing around as though the walls might be listening. Big ones, and he's already behind. I wasn't surprised. Edward had always lived 2 steps ahead of his means, patching one hole by tearing open another. My daughter, blinded by the illusion of luxury, either didn't notice or didn't want to. She paraded around town talking about their European trip, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. She described business meetings in Paris, investments in Italy, opportunities that sounded more like daydreams than real plans. The truth surfaced when Edward himself called me one evening, his voice unusually polite. Mrs. Collins, he began, clearing his throat. There seems to have been some confusion with the paperwork for the house. Perhaps we could meet and sort this out? His words were oily, practiced, the kind of tone men use when they're backed into a corner but too proud to admit it. I kept my voice calm, steady. "There is no confusion, Edward. The house was never yours to sell." He chuckled nervously. Yes, of course. But you see, these buyers are very serious people. They've already invested. If the deal doesn't go through, there will be consequences." Ah, there it was. The real Edward, hinting at threats, hoping to intimidate. I almost pitied him. Almost. "I'm not afraid of your buyers," I replied. "And if they're foolish enough to trust you, then the consequences belong to you, not me." The silence that followed told me more than his words ever could. He was drowning, and he wanted me to throw him a rope. But I had spent decades throwing ropes to my daughter, only to have her tie them around my neck. Not anymore. By the end of that week, rumors of Edward's financial troubles grew louder. A failed investment here, a bounced check there. People started to whisper his name with pity instead of admiration. My daughter, however, kept her chin high, refusing to let the cracks in her perfect picture show. She bragged louder, laughed harder, as if volume alone could hold her world together. But I had seen enough storms to know the pattern. The wind picks up, the sky darkens, and people convince themselves the rain won't fall. Until it does. Sudden, merciless, drenching everything they thought was untouchable. And when that storm finally broke, I knew my daughter would come running back to me. The question was, would I let her in? It was less than 2 months after that phone call from Edward when the truth came crashing down. My daughter had left for Europe with him, her suitcase brimming with designer clothes, and her voice full of promises about the life we deserve. She barely said goodbye, only tossing over her shoulder that she'd check in when things settled. But things didn't settle. They unraveled. The first sign was a terse email, sent not to me, but accidentally forwarded by a friend who still worked at the travel agency in town. Edward had used borrowed money he never planned to repay, to book flights and hotels. The business meetings were a facade. There were no contracts, no investors, just smoke and mirrors. Then came the call. My daughter's voice, stripped of its arrogance, cracked through the receiver. "Mom," she whispered, "Edward's gone. He left me in Paris. I don't have a return ticket. I don't have anything." For a moment, I closed my eyes and let the words sink in. I should have felt fury or maybe satisfaction, but what I felt most was exhaustion. This was the storm Richard had warned me about. And here it was, breaking exactly as he had predicted. "I'll send you a ticket home," I said softly. Her sobs echoed down the line, loud enough to make my heart twist despite everything. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice small, almost childlike. For just a moment, I heard my little girl again, the one who used to crawl into my lap during thunderstorms and beg me to promise that the roof wouldn't blow away. When she returned, she was almost unrecognizable. Her hair, once perfectly styled, hung limp. Her clothes, wrinkled from days of travel, carried the faint smell of desperation. She walked into my house without meeting my eyes, dropped her suitcase by the door, and muttered, "I had no one else to call." I wanted to tell her that was the truth, that she had burned every bridge except mine. But instead, I guided her to the kitchen table and set down a cup of tea. She wrapped her hands around it, trembling, though the day was warm. For hours, she spoke in fragments, the empty promises Edward had made, the debts he had hidden, the humiliation of being abandoned in a foreign country with no plan, no money, no dignity. Each word was a shard of glass, slicing away the glossy picture she had tried so hard to paint. By the time she finished, she was silent, staring into her untouched tea. I studied her then, the woman who had sold my house, mocked my sacrifices, and left me discarded with a single bye. She was broken. But broken doesn't always mean softened. Sometimes it just means sharper edges. I knew I had to make a choice. I could cradle her wounds, as I always had, stitching her mistakes together with my own hands until she could walk again. Or I could do what Richard had prepared me for, let her feel the weight of her actions, let her struggle until she understood what dignity truly costs. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, she whispered, "Can I stay here? Just until I figure things out?" I nodded slowly. "You can stay." But this time, There will be rules. Her mouth opened, ready to argue, then closed again when she saw my expression. For the first time in years, I wasn't pleading or bargaining. I was setting boundaries. And whether she realized it yet or not, those boundaries were going to change everything. The first night she stayed under my roof again, the house felt different, heavier somehow. Not because of her suitcase by the door or the extra dishes in the sink, but because of the air between us, thick with things unsaid. She moved quietly, almost cautiously, as though waiting for me to slip back into my old role, the mother who gave without question. But I had already decided. That woman no longer lived here. The next morning, I set a plate of toast and eggs in front of her. She muttered a tired "thanks" without looking up. I let her eat in silence before I spoke. "There are conditions if you're going to stay here," I said calmly. My tone surprised even me, firm, not harsh, but final. She froze, her fork hovering in midair. "Conditions?" she repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Yes," I replied. "This is not a free ride. You will contribute to this household. You will look for work, real work, and you will treat me with respect. No demands, no manipulation. Those days are over." Her eyes widened, then narrowed, the way they used to when she was a teenager caught sneaking in after curfew. "Are you serious? After everything I've been through?" I leaned forward slightly. "Especially after everything you've been through. If you want dignity back, you'll have to earn it." For a long moment, she stared at me, her expression flickering between anger and disbelief. Finally, she slammed her fork down. "I can't believe you're doing this to me. You're my mother. You're supposed to help me." I met her gaze without flinching. "I am helping you, just not in the way you expect." She scoffed, pushing her chair back. "You think I'm going to scrub floors or bag groceries like some nobody? I'm better than that." My voice was steady. "Right now, you're not better than that. Right now, you need to start somewhere, anywhere. Pride won't put food on the table." Her face reddened, and for a second I thought she might storm out. But she didn't. She sat back down, arms crossed, jaw tight. She ate the rest of her breakfast in silence, every bite a quiet act of defiance. Over the next few days, the tension simmered like a pot, just below boiling. She scrolled endlessly on her phone, sighing loudly, muttering complaints about the jobs she saw online. "Too far," she said of one. "Too boring," of another. "Too beneath me," of almost all of them. But I didn't bend. Each time she tried to draw me into an argument, I kept my voice calm, repeating the same line. "If you want to stay, you need to work." One evening, she finally caved. She came into the kitchen, her voice low, almost sulky. "I got an interview at a cleaning company." She rolled her eyes, waiting for me to soften, to tell her she was too good for it. But I only smiled gently and said, "Good. Honest work is never beneath anyone." She groaned, muttering under her breath as she left the room. But I noticed something she didn't mean for me to see. The smallest flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, a crack in her armor. For the first time since she had walked back into my house, I felt a fragile thread of hope. She wasn't changing yet, not fully, maybe not even consciously, but the ground beneath her feet was shifting. And this time, I wasn't going to carry her across it. She would walk it herself, or not at all. Her first day of work came on a gray Monday morning, the kind where the sky feels too heavy and the air tastes like rain. She dressed in an old pair of jeans and a faded sweatshirt she had once mocked me for wearing. Gone were the manicured nails, the perfect makeup, the perfume that announced her arrival before she entered a room. She tied her hair back in a plain ponytail, her face pale and stripped of its usual confidence. I watched her leave the house without offering to drive her. Part of me ached at the sight, because she was still my daughter, but another part of me knew this was exactly what needed to happen. She had to feel the weight of life pressing on her shoulders, not just the thrill of spending money she hadn't earned, but the exhaustion of working for every dollar. That evening, she returned with her hands raw from scrubbing and her voice hoarse from complaining. "Do you have any idea what it's like to clean up after strangers?" she demanded, dropping her bag onto the floor. "They're disgusting. The bathrooms alone. Mom, I almost threw up." And the manager yelled at me because I was too slow. I set a plate of food on the table and said nothing, letting her rant. She went on and on about the humiliation, about how she was smarter than the other women there, how unfair it was that she had to work so hard for so little. Finally, I said quietly, "That's how most people live. That's what dignity costs. Earning your way, even when it's hard, even when it feels beneath you." She glared at me, her fork clattering against the plate. "So what? You expect me to do this forever? Waste my life mopping floors?" "No," I answered, meeting her eyes. "I expect you to learn something from it, to understand the value of what you once threw away." Her mouth opened, then closed again. For a moment, I thought she might cry, but instead she pushed her chair back and stormed to her room, the door slamming shut behind her. The days that followed were no easier. She dragged herself out of bed before sunrise, came home smelling of bleach and sweat, and collapsed onto the couch in silence. Her arrogance was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but exhaustion had begun to dull its edges. I could see it in her posture, in the way her voice faltered when she complained. She was learning, slowly, painfully, that life doesn't bend to entitlement. One night, after another long day, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her blistered hands. Her voice was softer this time, almost uncertain. "I don't know if I can keep doing this." I poured her a glass of water and sat across from her. "You can," I said. "You just don't want to. But that's how strength is built. You keep going even when you don't want to." She didn't respond, but she didn't argue either. And in that silence, I caught a glimpse of something I hadn't seen in her for years. Humility. Fragile. Trembling. But real. It was only the beginning. But beginnings, I knew, were everything. It was a Saturday morning when the past came knocking again, not through a phone call this time, but through the discovery of something long forgotten. I was in the attic, sorting through boxes of old clothes and holiday decorations, when my daughter's voice called up the stairs. "Mom, what's this?" I climbed up slowly, the wooden steps creaking beneath my feet. She was crouched in the far corner, holding a small wooden box I hadn't seen in years. Dust coated its surface, but the brass lock gleamed faintly in the weak light. My heart skipped as recognition struck. It was the jewelry box Richard had tucked away before he died. He had mentioned it once, in passing, on a night when his illness had left him too tired to eat, but still strong enough to speak softly into the darkness. "Someday," he had said, "she'll find it. Don't rush. The timing will matter." My daughter turned the box over in her hands, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Do you have a key?" she asked. I nodded, my fingers trembling as I retrieved the small brass key from the chain I kept tucked inside my dresser. For years, I had carried it without knowing if I would ever need it. Now, it felt like Richard had chosen this very moment. When the lock clicked open, the lid creaked back to reveal velvet-lined compartments filled with jewelry. Rings, necklaces, earrings, pieces I had never seen before. They weren't just valuable, they were breathtaking. Diamonds catching the light, gold gleaming as if untouched by time. My daughter gasped, her eyes wide with the same hunger I had seen too many times before. "Oh my God," she whispered, lifting a necklace as though it were holy. "Do you have any idea how much this is worth? We could pay off everything. Edward's debts, my bills, we could start fresh." Her voice carried urgency, almost desperation, and in that moment I understood what she saw. Not beauty, not sentiment, but salvation. To her, the jewels were an escape hatch, another shortcut. I, however, felt something different. As I ran my fingers over the pieces, I noticed a folded envelope tucked beneath the velvet lining. My chest tightened. Inside was Richard's handwriting, careful and deliberate. "For Margaret and for our daughter. Use this not just as treasure, but as a mirror. Let it show her what she values most and what she must learn to value instead." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Richard had thought of everything, even this. My daughter, impatient, snapped me out of the moment. "Mom, listen to me. We have to sell these. The money could fix everything. Don't you see? This is our chance. I closed the box gently, holding her gaze. They're not just things to sell. Your father left them for us as a lesson, not as another way to escape consequences. She groaned, throwing her hands in the air. A lesson? Seriously? He left a fortune, and you want to waste it on some moral story? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I held the box close, feeling its weight, hearing Richard's voice in the back of my mind. He hadn't left these jewels for her to squander. He had left them for me to use wisely, to guide her, to remind her that real wealth wasn't in gold or diamonds, but in dignity, respect, and honest work. Still, I knew this jewelry box was going to test her more than any cleaning job ever could, because temptation, especially for her, was a louder teacher than hardship. And I was determined to make sure she learned. The day of the meeting felt heavier than any other. I had arranged it quietly, with Mr. Harper's help, knowing that the time had come to end the guessing games. My daughter walked into the lawyer's office with her chin high, though her eyes betrayed the storm still raging inside her. She carried the jewelry box clutched tightly against her side, as though afraid I might snatch it away. Edward wasn't with her. By then, his name had become a curse in town, attached to whispers of unpaid debts and failed ventures. Perhaps she was ashamed, or perhaps he had finally abandoned her for good. Either way, she arrived alone. Mr. Harper greeted us warmly, but with a gravity that filled the room. His office smelled of polished wood and old paper, the air heavy with the weight of truths long buried. He gestured for us to sit, and for a moment the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on his wall. Mrs. Collins, he began, turning to me with a respectful nod. As we discussed, it is time to clarify certain matters. He slid a stack of documents across the table. My daughter leaned forward eagerly, her eyes darting to the pages like a starving person spotting food. These papers, Mr. Harper continued, detail the assets your late husband secured under your name, Mrs. Collins. Properties, accounts, investments, all protected and beyond dispute. Legally, they belong solely to you. My daughter's breath caught. What do you mean? To her, she asked, her voice rising. I mean exactly that, Mr. Harper said gently but firmly. Your father ensured your mother would never be left vulnerable. He structured everything so that she alone holds the rights. That includes the beach house. The attempted sale you arranged holds no validity. In the eyes of the law, it never happened. Her face drained of color. That's not possible, she whispered. Edward told me. She stopped herself, biting down on her lip. I reached across the table and placed the envelope Richard had left me next to the documents. Your father knew this day would come, I said softly. He saw the choices you were making, even when I refused to. He wanted to protect us both, not just with money, but with wisdom. Her eyes darted to the jewelry box on her lap. She lifted it quickly, almost defiantly. What about this? He left this for me, for us. I nodded slowly. Yes. And he left a note inside, one you haven't bothered to read. She frowned, opening the box to pull out the folded paper I had shown her days before. Her hands shook as she read Richard's handwriting, his words reminding her that the jewels were not just treasure, but a mirror of what she valued and what she needed to learn to value instead. Her lips quivered as she set the paper down. For once, she had no sharp words, no mocking laughter, just silence. Mr. Harper leaned back in his chair, giving us space. Your father loved you both, he said quietly, but he also understood responsibility. He wanted you to find your own strength, not just inherit it. Tears welled in her eyes, though she blinked them back fiercely. So what now? She asked, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I took a deep breath. Now, you decide who you want to be. Not who Edward wanted you to be, not who you pretended to be. You. You've been given a chance most people never get. Another chance. Don't waste it. The room was silent again, but this time the silence wasn't heavy. It was waiting for her to choose. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe She just might. Change never arrives like a lightning bolt. It seeps in, quiet and stubborn, reshaping a person piece by piece. In the weeks after the meeting at Mr. Harper's office, I began to see flickers of something new in my daughter. Not a miracle, not a sudden conversion, but the fragile beginnings of humility. She still worked at the cleaning company. At first, every evening she came home fuming, her complaints as predictable as the clock striking 6. "The manager treats me like dirt," she would say. Or, "Do you know how hard it is to scrub other people's kitchens all day?" I would listen, nodding, sometimes offering a soft, "Yes, I know. I've lived it." And slowly, the tone of her complaints shifted. Less venom, more weariness, more honesty. One night, I walked past her room and saw her sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at her blistered hands. She didn't notice me watching. She whispered to herself, "At least it's mine. I earned it." Those words caught in my chest like a spark of something fragile but real. For the first time, she had taken ownership of her labor. Her pride began to soften. Instead of dismissing her coworkers as nobodies, she started telling me their stories. A single mother working 2 jobs to feed her kids. An older man saving every penny to bring his family over from another country. I saw my daughter's eyes shift as she spoke, not wide with greed but heavy with recognition. She was no longer surrounded by illusions of grandeur. She was shoulder to shoulder with people who survived through grit, the very thing she had always mocked. There were setbacks, of course. One Saturday, she stormed into the kitchen, slamming her cleaning gloves on the counter. "I'm done. I can't live like this." Her voice shook with frustration, and for a moment I braced myself for the old arrogance to return. But then she surprised me. Her anger gave way to tears. "I don't want to run away anymore, Mom. I don't want to be like Edward." I reached for her hand, roughened now, a mirror of my own after years of labor. "Then don't," I said simply. "Choose different." The following Monday, she didn't quit. She went back. That small act, that choice to show up despite her pride, felt bigger than any apology she could have spoken. In time, she began talking about the future differently. Not in glittering dreams of fast money or glamorous trips, but in cautious, almost tender hopes. "Maybe I could take some classes," she said one evening while drying the dishes. "Something in social work. I want to help people like the women I clean with. They remind me of you." Those words pierced me, but not with pain. With something warmer, something closer to pride. I didn't say it aloud. I didn't want to scare the moment away, but inside, I whispered a quiet thank you to Richard. His plan had worked, though not in the way either of us might have imagined. Transformation is never instant. It is earned one decision at a time. And as I watched my daughter stumble, fall, and choose to stand again, I realized this was the lesson Richard had meant for her all along. The seasons shifted before I realized how much had changed between us. Where there had once been shouting matches and slammed doors, now there was quiet companionship. Not perfect, never perfect, but real. My daughter still carried her sharpness, but it was softer now, tempered by experience. And for the first time in years, she looked at me not as an obstacle or a wallet, but as a person. One Sunday afternoon, we drove to the beach house together. It had been months since the storm of betrayal and confrontation, months since she had tried to erase the very walls that had raised her. I half expected the visit to stir old resentment in her, but when we pulled into the sandy driveway, she was the first to step out of the car. She stood there for a long while, her gaze sweeping over the peeling shutters, the weathered porch, the salt-stained siding. "It's smaller than I remember," she murmured, almost to herself. "But it feels warmer, too." I walked beside her, the wind tugging at my coat, the ocean roaring faintly in the distance. "It always felt warm to me," I said softly, "because it wasn't just a house. It was safety." We unlocked the door together, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, dust had gathered in corners, and the furniture smelled faintly of salt and thyme. She ran her fingers over the worn wooden table where we'd once shared meals, where she had done homework she never finished, where Richard had sipped his coffee while reading the newspaper. "Mom," she said quietly, "I was wrong about this place." Her voice cracked, heavy with the weight of years unspoken. "I thought it was just walls and wood, but it's our story, isn't it?" My chest tightened. For so long I had begged her to see what the house meant. And now, standing here in the dim light of afternoon, she had finally said it herself. We sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, the sky painted in streaks of orange and pink. Waves crashed against the shore, steady and unbothered by our human dramas. That's when she turned to me and asked, "What if this house could mean safety for more than just us?" I tilted my head, curious. She continued, her words careful but earnest. "At work, I've met women who've been through things you can't imagine. Abuse, poverty, abandonment. They don't have anywhere safe to go. What if we made this house that place? A shelter, a refuge." The idea hung in the salty air, bold and fragile all at once. My first instinct was disbelief. After all, this was the same daughter who once measured life only in money and status. But her eyes told me the truth. She meant it. I thought of Richard, of the way he had built this house, not just for comfort, but for protection. I thought of all the times I had felt its walls shield me from storms, both literal and emotional. And I realized he would have loved this idea. A smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. "It won't be easy," I said. "It'll take money, work, patience." She nodded firmly. "I know. But maybe that's the point. Maybe I need to build something the right way this time." The tide rolled in, waves washing higher along the sand, as if the ocean itself was marking the beginning of something new. For the first time, I saw not just my daughter, but a woman slowly becoming the kind of person her father had always believed she could be. And I allowed myself to believe it too. Turning the beach house into a shelter was not a simple dream. It was work, endless and demanding. The first step was repairing what time and neglect had worn down. The shutters barely clung to their hinges, the roof sagged under years of storms, and the plumbing sang its own mournful tune. My daughter stood in the middle of it all, hands on her hips, looking both overwhelmed and determined. "This place is a mess," she admitted, brushing cobwebs from her sleeve. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "But it's worth it." We began small. I scrubbed floors while she scraped peeling paint. Neighbors, curious at first, eventually joined in. A retired carpenter offered his tools, a young woman from my church donated bedding, even the owner of the local hardware store slipped us discounts when he learned what we were building. For the first time in years, the house buzzed with life again, not the laughter of one family, but the collective hum of a community pulling together. The work broke down walls between us that words never could. My daughter, who once recoiled at the idea of manual labor, now worked with blistered hands and paint smudges on her cheeks. She didn't complain, not like before. When her arms ached, she pushed through. When I reminded her to rest, she shook her head. "No, Mom. This time I need to finish what I start." One afternoon, while sanding the porch rail, she looked up at me, sweat beading her forehead. "I used to think you were weak," she confessed. "Always giving, always sacrificing. I thought people walked all over you. But you weren't weak. You were strong in ways I didn't understand." Her words hit me harder than any insult she had ever thrown. For a moment, my throat tightened, and I had to turn away, pretending to inspect a loose nail. Richard had always said she would see it someday, and now here she was, finally beginning to understand. Within a few months, the house began to transform. Fresh paint brightened the walls, new locks secured the doors, and donated furniture filled the rooms with warmth. The biggest change wasn't in the wood or the nails, it was in the atmosphere. Where there had once been silence and resentment, now there was purpose. The first time we opened the doors to women in need, I stood on the porch clutching a mug of coffee, my heart pounding. They arrived quietly, some with children clinging to their legs, others carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs. My daughter greeted them at the door, her voice steady, her smile genuine. I watched her kneel to help a little boy tie his shoes, and for the first time, I saw her not as the girl who had betrayed me, but as a woman finding redemption. That night, after everyone had settled, we sat side by side on the porch. The ocean roared softly in the distance, a lullaby older than both of us. My daughter's hands were still rough from labor, but when she reached over and placed one gently over mine, I didn't pull away. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she said quietly. I squeezed her hand, my eyes stinging with tears. "You gave me every reason to," I whispered. "But maybe Richard was right. Maybe love means holding on, even when it hurts." The stars shimmered above us, and for the first time in years, I felt peace. Not because everything was perfect, it wasn't, but because we were finally building something together, something honest, something strong enough to last. Transformation is not a single moment. It is a string of choices, each one tugging a person toward who they are meant to become. I watched my daughter make those choices, slowly and sometimes painfully, until the woman sitting across from me no longer resembled the one who once ended every conversation with a cold "bye." The cleaning job, which she once despised, became her stepping stone. One evening, after a long shift, she sat at the kitchen table with a notebook open, pages filled with scribbled ideas. "I want to go back to school," she said suddenly, her voice cautious, as if afraid I'd laugh. "Not for business, not for something flashy, for social work. I want to help people like the women we see here, people who need someone to fight for them." My heart swelled, but I kept my voice steady. "That sounds right," I said softly. "That sounds like purpose." The following weeks were a blur of applications, late nights studying for entrance exams, and nervous anticipation. When the acceptance letter arrived, she held it with trembling hands, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I did it, Mom," she whispered. For the first time in years, her pride didn't feel hollow. It felt earned. Classes were not easy for her. She complained at first about the reading, the essays, the discipline it required. But instead of quitting, she pushed harder. She spent evenings at the library, mornings volunteering at the shelter we had built out of the beach house, afternoons working part-time shifts to cover her books. Slowly, her life began to shape itself into something meaningful. And in the process, our relationship changed too. She began to thank me, not with grand gestures, but with small words that slipped out when she wasn't guarding herself. "Thanks for dinner, Mom. Thanks for helping me review. Thanks for believing I could do this." Each thank you was a patch on the torn fabric between us, stitches binding us closer than we had been in decades. 6 months later, she stood in front of a classroom full of women at the shelter, giving a talk about resources for survivors of abuse. Her voice was strong, her words deliberate, her passion undeniable. I sat in the back, tears streaming down my face, thinking of Richard. I wished he could have seen her like this, fighting not for wealth or status, but for dignity, for justice, for the very values he had built his life upon. That evening, as we walked home together under the pale light of the moon, she said, "I used to think success was about what you could show off, but now I see it's about what you give back." She paused, then added quietly, "You and Dad gave me everything, even when I didn't deserve it. I can't undo the hurt I caused, but I can try to live in a way that honors you both. I didn't need more than that." In those words, I heard the echo of the little girl I had once rocked to sleep, the one who had gotten lost along the way but had finally found her way home. The beach house stood brighter than ever, not because of the new paint or the repaired roof, but because of the lives it now sheltered. Women came and went, carrying with them stories of fear, courage, and survival. Some stayed only a week, others for months, but each left a mark on those old wooden walls. Laughter echoed again in the hallways, children's footsteps pattered across the porch, and the salty wind seemed to sing through the open windows. It felt alive, renewed, as though Richard himself had breathed hope back into it. My daughter thrived in this new chapter. She balanced her classes with shifts at the shelter, her eyes shining with a purpose I had once thought she'd never find. She spoke with conviction now, not arrogance. She listened, truly listened, to the women who trusted her with their pain. And slowly, the people in town stopped whispering about her mistakes and started nodding with respect when her name was mentioned. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun sink into the horizon, she turned to me with a look I hadn't seen in decades, soft, humble, grateful. "I used to think you were weak," she said quietly, repeating the confession she had once given me during renovations. "But I see now. You were stronger than anyone. You carried me when I should have carried myself. And you never gave up, even when I gave you every reason to." Tears welled in my eyes, but this time they weren't from sorrow. They were from release. "You've finally found your own strength," I replied, my voice steady. "That's what your father wanted for you. That's why he planned all of this, not just to protect me, but to give you the chance to grow." The ocean roared softly in the distance, a reminder that life, like the tide, ebbs and flows. I thought of Richard then, his quiet smile, his patient wisdom, and the envelope that had sat untouched for 12 long years. He had known this moment would come. He had trusted me to carry his plan forward. And now, seeing our daughter transform, I knew his trust hadn't been misplaced. As the stars appeared, my daughter slipped her hand into mine. For once, there was no tension, no hidden agenda, just the warmth of connection. "I want to make you proud," she whispered. "You already have," I said. The house, the shelter, the life we had rebuilt together. It was more than survival. It was a legacy. Not of wealth, not of jewels, but of dignity, respect, and love. And though Richard was gone, I felt him there with us, in every brick, every laugh, every wave crashing against the shore. For the first time in many years, I allowed myself to believe in peace, not as a fragile illusion, but as something we had earned, together. My story is not just about a house. It is about the fragile thread that ties parents and children together, about the weight of sacrifice, and the courage it takes to stop being used and start setting boundaries. For too long, I let myself be treated as nothing more than what I call an ATM mom, a mother who gave endlessly, quietly, until I was drained of everything but love. I thought that was strength. But real strength, I learned, is not in giving until you vanish. It is in protecting your dignity, even from those you love most. When my daughter sold my beach house without asking, I thought my world was crumbling. Instead, I discovered that my husband had seen further than I ever could. Richard left me not only security, but a lesson hidden inside his silence, that foresight and patience are forms of love too. He knew our daughter's flaws, and he prepared me to face them. In doing so, he gave her the chance to change. And change, though slow, did come. I watched her fall. I watched her suffer. I let her feel the sting of her own choices, and though it broke my heart, I did not shield her from it. Because love is not rescuing someone from every storm. It is teaching them how to stand in the rain and find their own umbrella. She found hers. Through humble work, through blisters and exhaustion, through facing her reflection in the lives of women braver than she realized, my daughter discovered that real wealth is not in trips or jewels. It is in dignity, respect, and the quiet courage of honest labor. And now, together, we have turned what was once only my dream, a simple beach house, into something far larger, a home where women can heal, rebuild, and find safety. I share this with you because I know many of you have faced the same wounds. Maybe you too have children who treat you as though your worth is only in what you can give. Maybe you have been an ATM mom. Maybe you have endured silent abuse or betrayal from the very people you sacrificed everything for. If that is you, please listen. Your love is not weakness, but it must be guided by limits. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are the guardrails that protect dignity for you and for them. I am 71 years old, and I have learned that it is never too late to reclaim your strength, to set a line in the sand, to demand respect, even from your own children. My husband's wisdom, my daughter's fall, and my own courage taught me that survival is not enough. We are meant to live with purpose. So I leave you with this. Never confuse silence with surrender, and never confuse sacrifice with servitude. Love fiercely, but protect yourself fiercely too. Now, I'd like to ask you, have you ever faced a betrayal from someone in your own family? Where in the world are you listening from, and how did you find the courage to rise again? Share your story in the comments, subscribe if you haven't yet, and if my journey touched you, consider leaving a super thanks to support more stories like this. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden battles inside families, I recommend you watch the next life story waiting on this channel. See you in the next life story with love and respect.